The sun hadn't even cleared the horizon yet, but the heat was already beginning to shimmer off the asphalt of the driveway. Alina stood by the kitchen window, a lukewarm mug of coffee pressed between her palms. Watching her father out there under the sagging boughs of an old oak tree, Silas was hunched over the open hood of the machine that Alina had come to loathe. It was a 1984 Econoline van, originally white but now a mottled, bruised shade of oxidized blue that looked like a stormy sea on a bad day. It sat on the gravel like a sleeping beast that refused to die, smelling faintly of diesel, old upholstery, and the peppermint tobacco her father favored. She watched him wipe a greasy hand on his coveralls, a grin spreading across his weathered face as the engine suddenly turned over. It didn't purr. It didn't hum. It cleared its throat with a roar that shook the window pane in Elaine's hand, a rhythmic, heavy thrum that sounded like a giant's heartbeat. "Ready for the big day, Elle?" Silas shouted over the noise, waving a wrench toward the house. Alina felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. Today was her first day at Sterling & Associates. It was the kind of internship people in their small town didn't get a high-rise office. Glass walls and a parking lot filled with German-engineered sedans that cost more than her family's entire house. She had spent 4 years at university working 3 jobs to buy the right suits, the right shoes, and the right briefcase. She had carefully constructed a version of herself that looked like she belonged in that world, and now she was supposed to arrive in a rust bucket that looked like it belonged in a junkyard. She walked out the front door, her heels clicking softly on the porch steps. The contrast was almost comical. Alina was dressed in a crisp charcoal gray blazer and tailored trousers, her hair pulled back into a sleek, professional bun. Her father looked like he had been dragged through an oil pit. "Dad, we talked about this," Alina said, her voice soft but strained. "I saved up for the bus pass. I can just take the 402 into the city. It's fine." Silas stopped wiping the engine block and looked at her, his blue eyes twinkling behind smudged glasses. "The bus? Elle, the bus is at the mercy of a schedule. This van, this is freedom. I've spent 6 months gutting the interior, reinforcing the frame, and tuning that engine until it's tighter than a drum. You're not just driving a car. You're driving a fortress. It's a fortress with a sliding door that squeaks like a dying bird." "Dad," she countered, "I'm trying to make a professional impression. I'm the scholarship kid from the valley. If I show up in this, they won't see my degree." Silas's smile faded just a fraction, a shadow of hurt crossing his face before he masked it with a shrug. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key ring. "Lena, this world is obsessed with things that look good but break easy. I didn't build this to look good. I built it so you'd never be stranded." He pressed the keys into her hand. "They were heavy and cold. Just for today?" he asked. "The buses are unreliable with the construction on the bridge. I'd sleep better knowing you have your own wheels." Lena looked at the keys, then at the van, then at the grease-stained lines on her father's palms. She knew this was his way of saying he loved her. He didn't have money for a graduation party or a new car, so he had poured 1,000 hours of labor into this metal box. If she refused it, she wasn't just refusing a ride. She was refusing him. "Just for today," she whispered. The drive into the city was an exercise in pure, unadulterated mortification. Every time she stopped at a red light, she could feel the eyes of the drivers next to her. The van didn't idle quietly. It vibrated with a low-frequency rumble that made her rearview mirror a blur. As she crossed the bridge into the financial district, the towering glass buildings began to reflect the van's battered blue frame. She felt like an ink blot on a clean white page. When she finally reached the Sterling & Associates building, she didn't pull into the main entrance where the valets stood in gold-trimmed vests. Instead, she drove 3 blocks away, circling until she found a dim, cramped parking garage where she could tuck the van into a corner behind a concrete pillar. She turned the engine off, and the sudden silence felt heavy. She sat there for a moment, her heart racing, checking her reflection in the visor mirror. She looked professional. She looked like she belonged. As long as no one saw the van, she was safe. Entering the lobby of the office felt like stepping into the future. Everything was white marble and hushed whispers. Alina checked in at the front desk, her pulse settling as she was handed a sleek plastic ID badge. "Alina?" "Welcome," a voice called out. She turned to see Mr. Henderson, the head of the internship program. He was a man who looked like he had never had a speck of dust on his shoes in his entire life. Beside him stood two other interns, Leo and Clara. They were laughing about a weekend trip to the coast. Their clothes effortlessly expensive. "We were just heading up to the orientation suite," Henderson said, gesturing toward the elevators. "I hope the commute wasn't too much of a hassle. The bridge traffic can be a nightmare." "It wasn't bad at all," Alina said, forcing a polite smile. "I found a spot nearby." "Good, good," Henderson said. As they rode the elevator up to the 42nd floor, Leo glanced at Alina. "I saw a crazy old blue van turning into the garage down the street. It looked like something out of a horror movie. I told Clara I hoped the brakes worked, or it might take out half the block." Clara giggled, smoothing her silk skirt. "It's probably some contractor working on the plumbing. You'd think the building would have a policy against letting eyesores like that into the neighborhood." Alina felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. She stared at the floor, watching the numbers on the digital display climb higher and higher. She felt the heavy brass keys in her pocket, weighing her down. It's a secret anchor tied to her reputation. The rest of the morning was a blur of spreadsheets, NDAs, and corporate jargon. Alina worked harder than anyone else in the room. She took notes until her hand cramped. She volunteered for the tasks no one else wanted. She wanted to be so good, so indispensable, that even if they did find out about the van, it wouldn't matter. But the shame followed her. During the lunch break, the interns gathered in the break room, which overlooked the street below. "There it is." Leo pointed out the window. "It's like a giant bruised thumb sticking out of the parking lot." From 40 stories up, the blue van looked small, but its color was unmistakable. It sat amongst the sea of silver and black cars like a defiance. "My dad says people who drive cars like that have given up on life," Clara remarked, sipping her sparkling water. "It's a sign of a cluttered mind." Alina bit her lip, the taste of her homemade sandwich turning to ash in her mouth. She thought of Silas, his hands covered in oil, his back aching from leaning over that engine, all because he wanted her to be safe. He hadn't given up on life. He was the hardest working man she knew. But in this room, under these lights, his hard work looked like failure. She realized then that the van wasn't just a vehicle. It was a bridge between two worlds that didn't understand each other. To her father, it was a masterpiece of mechanical reliability. And Alina was caught right in the middle, terrified that the bridge was about to collapse. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, Alina was exhausted. She waited until everyone else had left the floor before she headed down to the garage. She walked quickly, her head down, praying she wouldn't run into Leo or Clara. When she reached the van, she leaned her forehead against the cool, dented metal of the door. "I hate you," she whispered to the van. She climbed inside and turned the key. The engine roared to life on the first try, a steady, powerful sound that filled the concrete garage. As she backed out of the space, she noticed a small note taped to the dashboard that she hadn't seen in her morning rush. It was her father's shaky handwriting on a piece of grease-stained notepad. "The world is going to try and tell you who you are based on what you have. L. Don't listen to M. It's what's under the hood that gets you home. Love, Dad." Alina crumpled the note and stuffed it into the Q folder. She didn't want a lesson in character. She wanted a car that didn't make her want to crawl into a hole and disappear. As she drove out into the evening traffic, the van's heavy suspension soaked up the potholes that made other cars swerve. She didn't notice. All she noticed was the reflection of the blue paint in the shop windows, reminding her exactly where she came from. She didn't know yet that the cluttered mind her father supposedly had was actually a visionary one. She didn't know that the horror movie van was the only thing standing between her and a history she hadn't yet written. For now, it was just a shame she had to carry, 1 mile at a time. The following week at the office felt like a long walk on a tightrope for Alina. She had developed a system. She would wake up at 4:30 a.m. long before the sun had even thought about rising. to ensure she could park the blue van in the furthest, darkest corner of the third-party parking garage. She walked the extra 6 blocks to the office in the morning chill, her heels clicking on the pavement, just to make sure no one from Sterling & Associates would ever associate her with that beast of a vehicle. But the pressure was building. The internship wasn't just about filing papers and making coffee. It was a constant competition. Mr. Henderson had announced that the final evaluation for the junior associate positions would take place during a mandatory 3-day corporate retreat. It wasn't going to be in a hotel or a city conference center. No, they were going to the summit, a luxury eco-lodge perched high in the northern mountains. It was a place designed to test leadership, teamwork, and, as Leo jokingly put it, how well you can handle a 5-star meal without a silver spoon. The instructions were clear. Everyone was responsible for their own transportation to the lodge. It was a 4-hour drive, the last hour of which involved steep, winding roads that were notorious for being difficult. Even in good weather, Alina sat at her desk, staring at the email invitation, her stomach doing slow, sickening flips. She couldn't afford a rental car. Her bank account was a desert, every penny spoken for by rent and the professional clothes she'd had to buy. She had checked the bus routes, but there was nothing that went even remotely close to the lodge. The nearest stop was 40 miles away in a small valley town. "Tay," Alina, Leo said, leaning over the partition of her cubicle. He was jingling the keys to a brand-new, metallic gray convertible his father had leased for him as a reward for getting the internship. "You need a ride to the retreat? Clara is riding with me, but we might be able to squeeze your bag in the trunk if it's small. Although I'm not sure where you'd sit. The back seat is basically just a shelf for my golf clubs." He wasn't really offering. He was showing off. "I'm fine, Leo. I have it covered," Alina said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You sure? It's a rough climb. My dad says the elevation gain is no joke. You need a real engine to get up there, not some city commuter." He smirked, probably thinking about the mysterious blue van he'd seen in the neighborhood. "I have it covered," she repeated. Turning back to her monitor that evening, Alina drove the van back to her father's workshop. The engine was humming with that deep, rhythmic thud that usually made her grit her teeth. But today, she listened to it differently. She needed this machine to work. She needed it to be invisible, but she also needed it to be invincible. Silas was under the chassis of an old tractor when she pulled up. He slid out on a wooden creeper, his face smeared with grease, looking like a man who was exactly where he was meant to be. "She's making a bit of a whistle in the high gears, Elle. Did you notice?" Silas asked, wiping his forehead with a rag that was more oil than cloth. "Dad, I have to drive to the mountains on Friday?" "To the Summit Lodge. It's a steep climb." Are you sure this thing can make it?" Silas stood up, his joints popping. He looked at the van with a sense of pride that Alina still couldn't quite wrap her head around. "Make it, Alina. I didn't just fix this van. I rebuilt it. Most of those fancy cars you see in the city are held together by plastic clips and computer chips. This is steel and mechanical intent. I put a heavy-duty cooling system in there because I knew you'd be heading up north eventually. I reinforced the suspension so you could carry a ton of bricks and not feel a bump." He walked over to the side door and slid it open. The sound was heavy, a metallic clack-she that felt solid. "Look here," he said, pointing to a panel he'd built into the interior wall. "I installed a secondary battery bank. It charges while you drive. And that tank under the floor? That's a 50-gallon freshwater reservoir with an industrial-grade filtration system. I know you think I'm crazy, but I spent 30 years seeing people get stuck because they didn't have the basics. I wanted you to have the basics. It's a corporate retreat, Dad, not a survival expedition," Alina sighed. "I just need to get there without the engine exploding or the door falling off in front of my boss." Silas patted the side of the van. "She won't let you down. Just watch the temperature gauge on the long climbs. If she gets hot, let her breathe. She's got a soul, Elle. Treat her like a partner, not a tool." Friday came with a sky the color of wet slate. A storm was brewing, the air heavy and humid. Alina packed her small suitcase. making sure to hide it in the back of the van under a tarp so no one would see her belongings if they looked through the windows. She started the drive early, hoping to arrive at the lodge before everyone else so she could park in the most remote spot available. The first 3 hours were fine. The van cruised along the highway, the heavy frame feeling planted and secure even as the wind began to pick up. But as she hit the foothills, the road began to change. The smooth asphalt gave way to cracked pavement, and the incline grew sharper. Alina watched the temperature needle. It stayed right in the middle, rock steady. She felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe her father was right. Maybe the bones were good, however. As she reached the final 5-mile stretch, a series of brutal switchbacks. Carved into the side of the mountain, the weather turned. The sky opened up, not with a drizzle, but with a torrential downpour that turned the road into a river. The wind howled through the pines, shaking the van up ahead. She saw the flash of hazard lights. A sleek silver SUV the kind Mr. Henderson drove was pulled over to the side. The driver's side window was down, and Henderson was staring at the front wheel, which was buried deep in a patch of mud where the road had partially washed away. Elena's heart hammered. This was her nightmare. She had to stop. She couldn't just drive past her boss. She pulled the van over, the heavy tires gripping the slick mud with a surprising amount of traction. She rolled down her window, the rain instantly soaking her sleeve. "Mr. Henderson, are you okay?" The man looked up, squinting through the rain. When he realized it was Alina, his eyes widened. Then he looked at the van. He looked at the rusted wheel wells, the mismatched blue paint, and the flickering taillight. A look of sheer confusion, followed by a hidden smirk, crossed his face. "Alina, is that your vehicle?" "It's my father's," she said, her face burning. "Do you need help?" "The electronic stability control just gave up," Henderson said, gesturing frustratedly at his dashboard, which was lit up like a Christmas tree with warning lights. "The sensors are clogged with mud, and the computer won't let the engine engage the wheels. I'm stuck until the rain lets up and I can call a tow." Alina looked at the road. It wasn't getting better. It was getting worse. "The lodge is only 2 miles up. I can give you a lift." "There's plenty of room." Henderson looked at the mud, then at his expensive Italian shoes, then at the battered interior of the blue van. He looked like a man choosing between 2 different types of poison. Finally, the cold went out. "All right." Just to the lodge, he climbed in, sitting on the passenger seat that smelled faintly of her father's peppermint tobacco. He looked around the cabin, noting the manual window cranks and the absence of a touchscreen display. "Very vintage," he said, trying to be polite. "It works," Alina said shortly. She shifted the van into a lower gear. She felt the engine growl, a deep guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. She eased off the clutch, and the van moved. It didn't spin its tires. It didn't beep at her. It simply gripped the earth and pulled. As they climbed, they passed Leo's convertible. It was parked under a rocky overhang, the top up. But the low-profile tires were clearly not meant for the river of slush the road had become. Leo and Clara were inside, looking miserable. Henderson sighed. "It seems we're the only ones moving." They reached the lodge just as the sun was setting, behind a wall of black clouds. The Summit Lodge was beautiful, a sprawling structure of glass and cedar butt tonight. It looked lonely against the storm. Alina parked the van as far from the main entrance as she could, but it was too late. Several other executives were standing under the porch awning, watching the blue van crawl up the drive. As Henderson stepped out, his colleagues began to chuckle. "Taking the bus today, Arthur?" One of them shouted. Henderson laughed it off. But Alina saw the way he distanced himself from the van the moment his feet hit the dry porch. "It's one of our interns." "Projects," he said, waving a hand vaguely toward Alina. Alina stayed in the van for a long time after he left. She watched the rain lash against the windshield. She felt a deep, cold ache in her chest. She had done exactly what her father told her to do. She had helped someone. She had used the bones of the machine to do what the shine couldn't. But as she heard the laughter from the porch echoing through the rain, she didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a joke. She felt like the girl who had brought a tractor to a ballroom dance. She reached out and patted the dashboard, her hand landing on the spot where the plastic was cracked. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but she wasn't sure if she was apologizing to the van or to herself. That night, the retreat began with a formal dinner. Alina sat at the end of the table, listening to the others talk about their cars, their gadgets, and their plans for the future. She felt invisible. Leo and Clara eventually made it up in a shuttle sent by the lodge, and they spent the entire meal mocking the blue ghost that had passed them on the mountain.
I mean,
"Seriously," Leo said, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "I thought it was a mobile scrap metal collection. I didn't know Sterling and Associates was hiring people from the 1940s. Alina kept her head down, focusing on her plate. She thought about the water reservoir under her feet and the secondary battery her father had been so proud of. Here, the only thing that mattered was how you looked. But as the wind outside began to howl with a new, terrifying intensity, the lights in the grand dining room flickered once, twice, and then went completely black. The silence that followed was heavy, and then the screaming of the wind was joined by a new sound, the distant, thunderous roar of the mountainside beginning to move. Alina sat in the dark, her heart suddenly still. She realized with a strange clarity that the real storm her father had warned her about wasn't coming anymore. It was already here. The darkness in the dining hall was thick, like a heavy blanket dropped over the room. For a few seconds, the only sound was the collective intake of breath from 50 people. Cell phones were pulled from pockets, their small screens casting ghostly blue light on pale faces. The elegant glass-walled room that had felt like a sanctuary moments ago now felt like a cage. Outside, the sound was no longer just rain. It was a deep, guttural grinding, the sound of the earth itself being torn apart. Alina felt a vibration in the soles of her feet that made her stomach churn. It wasn't just a storm. It was a landslide. Everyone stay calm. Mr. Henderson's voice rose above the chatter, though it lacked its usual authority. The lodge has backup generators. They should kick in any second, but they didn't. 10 seconds passed, 30, a minute. The silence of the building was terrifying. Usually, a place this expensive had layers of safety. But the sheer volume of mud and rock hitting the lower levels had snapped the main lines and crushed the generator shed like an eggshell. One of the lodge staff members ran into the room, his face drenched and his eyes wide with terror. "The road is gone," he shouted. The north slope collapsed. It took out the bridge and the power station. "We're cut off." The murmurs turned into shouting. Leo stood up, his face white. "What do you mean cut off?" "I have a flight on Monday." "Call someone. Use the satellite phone." "The tower is down, sir," the staff member said, his voice shaking. "Nothing is getting out." "And the water?" The main line burst when the ground shifted. "We have no running water." Alina sat quietly in the corner. While everyone else was looking at their dead phones or shouting at the staff, she was thinking about the bones of her father's van. She thought about the heavy-duty suspension, the 50-gallon water tank, and the secondary battery bank. She felt a strange, cold calm wash over her. As the night wore on, the luxury of the lodge began to peel away. Without heat, the mountain air seeped through the glass walls. Without water, the kitchens shut down. People huddled in their expensive wool coats, looking small and helpless. By dawn, the scene was grim. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the landscape was unrecognizable. A river of thick brown mud and shattered pine trees blocked the only path down. Several of the luxury cars in the front lot were half buried, their alarms chirping weakly like dying birds in the center of the lobby. A makeshift command center had been set up. Mr. Henderson was talking to the lodge manager. "We have 2 people in the guest wing who need their medication refrigerated, and a woman who went into early labor from the stress. We need power, and we need clean water." "I have water," Alina said. The group turned to look at her. She looked small, her professional suit wrinkled from sleeping in a chair, but her eyes were steady. "What?" Leo snapped, his hair a mess. "What are you talking about, Alina?" "The pipes are dry," "It's the van," she said, her voice growing stronger. "My father built a 50-gallon reservoir into the chassis. It has an industrial filtration system. It's clean, drinkable water. And I have a secondary battery bank and an inverter. We can plug the medical coolers into the van." There was a long silence. Henderson looked at her, then out the window at the battered blue van sitting at the edge of the lot. It was covered in mud and pine needles, looking more like a mountain than a vehicle. "That thing." Leo laughed, though it sounded forced. "You're saying that Rust Bucket is going to save us?" "It probably won't even start in this cold. Started in the flood on the way up," Henderson said, his voice quiet. He looked at Alina. "Can you get it closer to the door?" Alina didn't answer with words. She grabbed her keys and headed out into the mud. The air was freezing and the mud was mid-calf deep. She trudged toward the van, her expensive shoes ruined and forgotten. She climbed into the driver's seat. The interior felt like home. It smelled of her father and peppermint. She pumped the gas pedal twice, just like Silas had taught her, and turned the key. The engine didn't hesitate. It roared to life, a deep, mechanical growl that seemed to challenge the mountain itself. She shifted into four-wheel drive, a modification her father had made using parts from an old army truck, and eased the van forward, while the luxury SUVs sat high-centered in the mud. The van's narrow, heavy-duty tires sliced through the muck. She maneuvered it right up to the lodge's main entrance. For the next 5 hours, the shame of Elena's life became the center of the world. She opened the side panel, revealing the brass taps her father had installed. The lodge staff brought out pitchers and pots, and she began to fill them. The water was clear and cold. People who had been mocking her the night before now stood in line, holding their glasses with trembling hands. Next. A small cheer went up when the medical fridge hummed to life. Alina stood by the sliding door, her hands covered in grit, watching the scene. She saw Clara, the girl who had called the van an eyesore, holding a cup of the van's water to her lips like it was fine wine. She saw Leo standing by the hood, staring at the engine with a look of confused respect. But the real challenge was just beginning. A frantic shout came from the lodge office. "The medical outpost. We got a radio signal from the ranger station 5 miles down. They have 3 people injured from the slide, and they're out of oxygen and clean water. They can't get a helicopter in because of the cloud cover and the wind." Henderson looked at the mud-slicked road, then at the van. 5 miles? That's past the washout." "The van can make it," Alina said. She didn't say it to brag. She said it because she knew the bones. She knew the reinforced frame could handle the tilt of the mountain, and she knew the engine wouldn't quit. "It's too dangerous," Henderson whispered. "The road could give way at any second." "The people down there don't have a choice," Alina replied. She began to load the van. She took the extra oxygen tanks from the lodge's first aid room and more water. As she was about to climb into the driver's seat, a hand reached out and grabbed the door. It was her father's voice in her head, telling her to be careful. But it was Mr. Henderson standing there in person. "I'm coming with you," he said. "You don't have to," Alina said. "I'm the head of this firm, Alina. I'm supposed to lead. And right now, you're the only one showing me how to do that." They set off into the gray mist. Several times the van tilted at an angle that made Henderson gasp. But the heavy battery banks in the floor kept the center of gravity low. The van gripped. It pulled. It refused to die. As they reached the first major washout, Alina saw the true scale of the disaster. A 100-foot section of the road was gone, replaced by a steep slope of loose shale and mud. "We can't cross that," Henderson whispered. Alina looked at the slope. She remembered her father's words. People look at the paint job because they don't know how to look at the bones. She shifted into the lowest gear. "Hold on," she said. She didn't drive fast. She drove with a slow, relentless intent. The van groaned. The metal twisted and shrieked. But as the tires bit into the shale, the rust bucket began to climb. At that moment, Lena realized she wasn't ashamed anymore. The van wasn't a symbol of what her family lacked. It was a symbol of what they had, a resilience that couldn't be bought, a strength that was built in the dark, and a heart that didn't know how to quit. They reached the ranger station an hour later. The rangers looked at the blue van as if it were a chariot from heaven. As they unloaded the supplies, one of the rangers wiped the mud off the side of the van, revealing the original faded logo of her father's small repair shop. "Where did you get this machine?" the ranger asked, his voice full of awe. Alina looked at the van, then at the mountain they had just conquered. "My father built it," she said, her voice ringing with a pride she had never felt before. "And he built it for exactly this." Back at the lodge, the drones had started to fly. The weather was clearing, and news crews from the city were capturing footage of the disaster. In the center of every frame, moving through the mud, where nothing else could, was a battered, oxidized blue van. The story was no longer about a corporate retreat gone wrong. It was about the girl and the machine that refused to stay down. The sky over the mountain finally broke open, revealing a sharp, cold blue that seemed to mock the devastation on the ground. As the clouds pulled back, the sound of the wind was replaced by a distant, rhythmic thumping. It was the sound of helicopters. The outside world was finally coming to find them. Alina sat on the rear bumper of the van, her feet dangling over the mud. She was covered in a layer of grime that made her charcoal blazer look like a rag. Her hair, once pinned back in a perfect, professional bun, was now a tangled mess around her shoulders. She should have felt exhausted, and her muscles certainly ached, but there was a strange, buzzing energy in her chest that kept her upright. She watched as the first news helicopter circled the lodge. It hovered low, its camera turret swiveling to capture the wreckage of the road and the half-buried luxury cars. But then the helicopter shifted. It tilted toward the front entrance of the lodge, where the blue van sat parked like a muddy king on a throne of debris. Inside the lodge, the atmosphere had shifted from terror to a kind of frenzied relief. Mr. Henderson was on a satellite phone that a rescue crew had just brought in, his voice sounding small and distant. Leo and Clara were huddled together, looking at their own phones as the bars of signal slowly returned. They were checking their social media, their faces illuminated by the screens, already beginning to craft the stories of their survival. But as the news crews began to land on the small patch of dry grass near the lodge, they didn't head for the executives. They didn't head for the lodge manager. They saw the orange extension cords snaking out of the van's windows. They saw the crowd of people still huddled around the van's side door, filling cups from the brass taps. A reporter in a bright red windbreaker, followed by a cameraman, stepped off a chopper and marched straight toward Alina. "Is this the vehicle?" the reporter asked, not even waiting for a greeting. "We saw the footage from the drones." "You were the one who made the crossing to the ranger station?" Alina blinked, squinting against the bright sun. "I just drove," she said, her voice raspy. "You didn't just drive," the reporter said, turning to the camera. "We are standing here with the young woman who, against all odds, used a 40-year-old modified camper to provide the only clean water and power to this entire resort for the last 24 hours. While modern technology failed, this machine and this driver saved lives." Lena felt a surge of panic. She didn't want to be on camera. She wanted to go home. She wanted to see her father. But then she looked down at the side of the van. The mud had dried and flaked off in some spots, and she could see the faint, hand-painted lettering her father had put there years ago. "Silas's General Repair. We fix what matters." Suddenly, she didn't want to hide anymore. "My father built this," Alina said, looking directly into the lens. Her voice was no longer small. "He spent his whole life telling me that it's the bones of a thing that count, not the paint." I didn't believe him. I was ashamed of this van. I parked it blocks away from my job because I didn't want people to see where I came from. Behind the camera, she saw Mr. Henderson and the other interns watching. Leo looked stunned. Clara looked embarrassed. But when the world stopped working, Alina continued, the things I was ashamed of were the only things that worked. My father didn't build this to be pretty. He built it so I'd never be stranded. Within hours, the clip went viral. It wasn't just a local news story. It was a global sensation. In a world of sleek, fragile technology, people were hungry for something real. They were hungry for the story of a girl and her father's rust bucket. The next morning, the military and the state engineers arrived to begin clearing the road. Alina was told she could finally leave. As she prepared to drive down the mountain, now escorted by a convoy of utility trucks, Mr. Henderson approached her. He looked different. The polished, untouchable aura was gone. He looked like a man who had spent a night in the dark and realized his shoes didn't matter. "Alina," he said, holding out a hand, "I want to apologize. Not just for the comments about the van, but for not seeing the value in what you were bringing to the table. We spent a lot of time at the firm looking for the right fit, but we forgot to look for the right heart." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. On the back, he had scribbled a personal number. "When you get back to the city, take a week off. Then come see me. We're starting a new division for rural infrastructure and emergency logistics." And he smiled, glancing at the van. "I think we're going to need a specific type of fleet vehicle." Alina took the card, but she didn't look at it. She was looking at the road ahead. The drive down was different this time. People lined the parts of the road that were still standing, cheering as the blue van passed. Some held up signs. Others just waved. The shame had been washed away by the mud and replaced by something that felt like a heavy. Silas was sitting on his porch, a radio playing softly beside him. He wasn't jumping up and down. He wasn't cheering. He was just sitting there, waiting. With a mug of peppermint tea in his hand, Alina pulled the van to a stop and killed the engine. The silence was beautiful. She climbed out and ran to the porch, throwing her arms around her father. He smelled of oil and peppermint, the scent of her childhood, the scent of safety. "I saw you on the news, Elle," he whispered into her hair. "You were right about everything. The bones are everything." Silas pulled back, wiping a tear from her cheek with a thumb that was still stained with grease. "I didn't do it to be right, Alina. I did it because I knew the world would be hard on you. I just wanted to make sure you had a way to get through it." He looked past her at the van. It was a wreck. The bumper was hanging by a wire, the windshield was cracked, and the blue paint was barely visible under the mountain grime. "She looks like she's had a long trip," Silas said with a chuckle. "She's just getting started," Alina replied. She looked at the van and realized it wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a bridge. It was the bridge between her past and her future, between the girl she was and the woman she had become. It was a piece of history, not because of what it was made of, but because of what it had carried. The rust bucket was going to the city, but this time, Alina wouldn't be parking it in the shadows. The following year felt like a whirlwind that refused to slow down. Alina stood in the center of a large, high-tech garage on the outskirts of the city. Or was it the sterile, glass-walled office of Sterling and Associates? It was something entirely newer place, where heavy-duty engineering met modern social purpose. On the wall behind her was a logo that had become famous across the country, a simple, stylized outline of a van with the words "The Silas Foundation" underneath. Alina looked down at her hands. They weren't as clean as they used to be when she first started her internship. There was a faint trace of grease under her fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could quite remove, and for the first time in her life she didn't mind. In fact, she wore it like a badge of honor. The blue van, the original one, didn't sit in a scrapyard. It didn't even sit in a museum, though many had asked for it. It sat in the center of this very garage, meticulously cleaned, but with every dent and scratch preserved. It was the North Star for everything they did here. After the mountain disaster, Alina hadn't just taken a job. She had started a movement. Mr. Henderson had kept his word. He had realized that the corporate world was full of people who knew how to manage money, but empty of people who knew how to manage a crisis. He had provided the initial funding, but Alina had provided the soul. The foundation didn't build luxury cars. They took old, discarded transport vehicles, buses, delivery vans, even old mail truck sand. They built the bones. They reinforced the chassis. installed massive water filtration systems, and fitted them with solar-powered battery banks. They turned the world's junk into a fleet of disaster relief units that could be deployed to flooded valleys or storm-hit. Coastline's Alina walked over to a group of young mechanics interns from the same valley she had grown up in. They were huddled around a rugged-looking truck. "Remember," Alina said, her voice calm and confident, "if the sensors fail and the computer dies, the person driving this needs to be able to fix it with a wrench and a bit of common sense. Don't make it pretty. Make it impossible to break." The interns nodded, looking at her with the kind of respect she used to reserve for the executives in the high-dash rise. Later that afternoon, a sleek black car pulled into the gravel lot. Mr. Henderson stepped out. He looked older, more relaxed. He didn't wear a tie anymore. He walked over to Alina, shielding his eyes from the sun. "The board approved the expansion into the coastal regions," he said, handing her a folder. "They saw the footage of the units working after the hurricane last month. Even the skeptics are calling it the most efficient relief model they've ever seen." "It's not a model, Arthur," Alina smiled. "It's just what happens when you prioritize people over polish." "I know that now," he admitted. He looked at the original blue van. "You know, Leo called me the other day. He's working in a mid-level firm in the city. He asked if we had any openings here. He said he's tired of selling things that break." Lena felt a flicker of a smile. "Tell him he can apply. But tell him he'll have to learn how to change his own oil first. No valets here." As evening began to fall, Alina drove back to the small house in the valley. She didn't drive a sports car or a luxury. It's SUV. She drove a modified version of the Foundation's first prototype. When she pulled into the driveway, she saw her father sitting in his usual spot on the porch. Silas looked frailer than he had a year ago, his hands shaking slightly as he held his tea, but his eyes were as bright as ever. She sat down beside him, and for a long time, they just watched the fireflies dance over the tall grass. "They're calling it the Alina effect in the papers, Dad," she said softly. "They say I've changed the way the country thinks about infrastructure." Silas chuckled, a low, dry sound. "Papers like to use big words for simple things, Elle. You didn't change infrastructure. You just stopped being afraid of the truth. You realized that a shiny coat of paint is just a lie you tell the world, but the engine is the truth you tell yourself." "I used to think I was a failure because I didn't have what the other kids had," Lena said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I spent so much energy trying to be someone else." "I thought you were trying to shame me by giving me that van," I knew, Silas said. "I knew you felt that way. But I also knew that one day the wind would blow hard and the ground would shake. And all those people you were trying to impress would have nothing to hold on to. I wanted to make sure my daughter was the one holding the rope for everyone else." She thought about the mountain, the mud, and the terrifying sound of the earth moving. She thought about the moment she had realized that she was enough, not because of her degree or her suit, but because of the grit she had inherited from the man sitting next to her. She had made history, but not the kind you find in textbooks full of dates and kings. She had made the kind of history that lives in the hearts of the people who finally had clean water when they were thirsty, and the people who saw a light in the dark when they thought all hope was lost. Her father's old van had been meant to protect her, but in the end, it had liberated her. It had taught her that the things the world tries to use to shame you are often the very things that will save you. "Dad," she whispered. "Don't thank me," Silas said, closing his eyes as the cool evening breeze drifted over the porch. "Just keep the oil changed. Everything else is just details." Lena watched the moon rise over the valley. She was no longer the girl hiding in the shadows of a parking garage. She was a builder. She was a leader. And most importantly, she was her father's daughter. The road ahead was long, and there would be more storms, but she wasn't afraid. She had the bones to handle it.